Good evening, everyone. My name is Trevor Mears. I am with the Des Moines Public Library Foundation Board. Welcome to the sixth and final 2019 AViD event. Since 2001, there have been 144 AViD events attended by 48,392 people just like you. AViD is possible with the leadership of Tim Pollack and the community engagement team and input from the volunteer selection committee. We appreciate Sue Woody, the library director. Des Moines native Sue began her role as director in July of last year. We're also grateful for the excellent staff at all of the Des Moines Public Library locations who enhance the quality of all of our lives every day. The Des Moines Public Library Foundation and Executive Director Dory Briles raised the funds for AViD, summer reading and school readiness, programming for children, teens, and adults, and new public access computers. Foundation funding supports 87% of the library's free programs. Bringing outstanding authors like C.J. Chivers for AViD, free programs, the latest technology, and improving the library collections, it all takes more money than our tax dollars can provide. So please help us continue to make a difference with your gift to the Library Foundation. If you're so inclined tonight, there are envelopes out on the table that you can make a donation. A few details for tonight. Please do complete the blue evaluation form that's in your program. Getting information from that helps us secure funding for future AViD events. And also, if you leave your card at the information table, you will get a chance in a drawing to win a box of Hallmark cards, as well as an autographed copy of Nick Nolte's book, Rebel: Life Outside the Lines. Laughter ripples through the crowd at the mention of Nick Nolte, as always. If you purchase a book tonight from Beaverdale Books and have your book autographed by the author, 10% of the sales are donated to the Library Foundation. We want to thank some of our volunteers and sponsors who make our program possible. They are the premier sponsor of the Des Moines Register, the Nationwide Foundation, Principal Financial Group, Brad and Kelly Edmister, Humanities Iowa, a state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, the O'Brien Fitzpatrick Foundation, Karen Schaff and Steve Jane, Dr. Catherine and Andrew Hauser, Pamela Bass Bookie and Harry Bookie, Shelley and Martin Brody, Mary Ritchie, Douglas and Deborah West, Don Taylor, Judy Blank, and Marianne and Robert Sobiech. Our moderator tonight is Kathleen Richardson, who is the Dean of the School of Journalism at Drake University. Kathleen was an editor and writer for the Des Moines Register and Tribune for 20 years and has been at Drake since 1997. She served as executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council from 2000 to 2015. And tonight we're very excited to spend time with C.J. Chivers, a long-form writer and investigative reporter who works with the New York Times Magazine and the Investigations Desk. His Pulitzer Prize-winning cover story for the magazine in 2016 led to the release from an Illinois prison of an Afghan war veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Mr. Chivers was a Marine Corps infantry veteran of the Persian Gulf War, and he also had peacekeeping duties during the Los Angeles riots in 1992 before transitioning to journalism in 1994. He joined the Times in 1999 and worked in the New York City Police Bureau through the attacks on the World Trade Center of 2001. He then became a foreign correspondent focusing on conflict, human rights, and the arms trade on assignments in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Chechnya, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. In 2009, he was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for some of that coverage. Mr. Chivers' first book was 2010's The Gun, a history of automatic weapons and the consequences of their mass distribution seen through the development of the AK-47. On a personal note, I carried that book to India with me and back a few years ago, and it was far more entertaining than the in-flight movies, so thank you for that. His latest book is The Fighters, which focuses on the 2.7 million Americans who have served in Afghanistan or Iraq since September 11th. Mr. Chivers reported from both wars, from their beginnings. The Fighters vividly conveys the physical and emotional experience of war as lived by 6 combatants, a fighter pilot, a corpsman, a scout helicopter pilot, a grunt, an infantry officer, and a special forces sergeant. About The Fighters, the Christian Science Monitor said this: a masterful work of atmospheric reporting. It's a book that will have every reader asking, with varying degrees of urgency or anger or despair, the final question Chivers himself asked: how many lives have these wars wrecked? You'll have an opportunity to ask Mr. Chivers some questions after his talk, so please fill out the question cards inside your AViD programs and volunteers will collect them later. Now please join me in welcoming to the stage Kathleen Richardson and C.J. Chivers.
So before we get going, I'm just going to say thank you. And I have particular reasons, probably not why you're always thanked for coming out, which is, can't hear me? Let me lower it. I'm not as tall as you. Yeah. Is this better? So I'll start over. I want to say thank you before I get started, and I'm going to thank you for a different reason than you're usually thanked for turning up at a library, which is this. I come from families with long lines of American military service on both sides, maternal and paternal sides. I'm a former infantry officer myself. My brother was an infantry officer. I've got 4 sons. One of them's right now trying to get into the Marine Corps, and I think will succeed. After I left the Marine Corps, I traveled with combatants overseas immersively, lived with them, walked with them, tried to understand them completely. And during many years of this, now we're getting near 20 years since the wars began, I came to understand that far too few Americans pay much attention to the wars that we're engaged in at all. And they're not particularly interested in their costs or consequences either. And so to me, your being here matters. You know, I'm going to sing kind of an American dirge at you over the next few minutes. What I'm going to say, I hope, makes you uncomfortable. And I'm glad you're here. I'd say it to 6 people, and we've got a lot more than that. So thank you. I want to begin with an umbrella thought, so you know my framing lenses as I say what I'm going to say and read what I'm going to read. We're going to show a video, too. The thought is this: I am unapologetically negative about the organization of the recent American-led wars, the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm negative about the organizing ideas behind them and the practicalities and outcomes that have resulted. But I'm also indelibly empathetic to the people who showed up in good faith, in uniform, to do this country's bidding with the spirit of public service. I wasn't expecting applause. I didn't pause for that. I usually don't get applause. I get scowled at a lot. I'm struck by their admirable notions of public service. I'm going to share some of that today. But you will hear from me mostly sorrow and anger. So I'm going to, as I take this lens a little further down into focus, I'm going to ask you to share my angle of inquiry for a few minutes tonight. And it's pretty simple. It's this: I believe that the history and the public discourse of wars, most all wars, but including the 2 under discussion here, contain too much general and not enough sergeant. This evening, I'm going to ask you to think through the experiences of sergeants and people near sergeants. These are the men and women who actually fought and suffered in our wars, and whose stories and perspectives are overwritten by official bullshit and self-serving accounts. We're going to look at a video shortly. I'd like to declare a fact about these lenses, so you know, you've already heard it, but I was once one of these guys. I was a cookie-cutter officer of grunts, you know the type if you've served, a product of the weapons and tactics hatcheries, engaged and animated by a martial ethos. And since I set aside weapons and uniforms and allowed my allergy to authority fully blossom within me, I've made combatants a subject of immersive study. I happened to be present by chance at the attacks with hijacked aircraft on the World Trade Center in 2001. I was a few blocks away when it began, entirely by chance. And I've spent much of the long run of years since alongside various armed forces and factions. And I'm going to speak tonight with a painful honesty. And my hope, when we're done, is I will have bleached away some of the euphemism and dishonesty in the prevailing narratives about optional wars that we as a country chose and failed at. I'm going to show a video.
They're right there!
This is C.J. Chivers of the New York Times. The Marines of Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 6 Marines had been pushing through Marja, a Taliban-held area in southern Afghanistan. The Taliban were resisting. Often their tactic is to hit and run, and they aren't known as accomplished shots. But on this day, they massed and attacked 2 Marine platoons. They also had at least one man with them the Marines considered to be a sniper, which was unusual.
Hey, Bennett, the tree line in between both the buildings. Look at the tree line right in the middle of that. Deep where those impacts just were. They're squirting both ways.
The squirters, as Sergeant Brian Rogers, a squad leader, called them, were Taliban fighters a few hundred yards away, trying to escape across the open steppe. The sergeant ordered several Marines, including Lance Corporal Travis Vacola, who was 20, to suppress the Taliban positions with gunfire.
I want you low, though, Vacola. I got it. Hey.
At least one sniper, maybe more, was adjusting his shots. He'd almost determined the range and was overcoming the stiff crosswind. Listen closely as bullets pass overhead from a rifle heavier than a Kalashnikov.
Coming right over.
The Taliban usually shoot poorly. Not today. Sometimes in a firefight, inches matter. A dirt wall in the right place, like this one, can mean the difference between living and dying, especially at times like now, when a gunman in hiding has found the range.
Hey, that's accurate fire! Give you a direction and distance.
The sniper is likely using a rifle like these, which were found hidden in an Afghan home several hundred yards away. They're Lee Enfields. One was made in 1942. In the right hands, it's still deadly. The Marines here were working on a clear, an early step in the phases that now define American counterinsurgency doctrine. The goal was to push the Taliban out of the area so that government might be established and security transferred from American to Afghan hands. They expected this fight. They expect more. In a lull, Sergeant Rogers ordered a Marine to fire a smoke grenade near the presumed sniper position.
Not too far. You're marking the building. Hit him. Yeah, that's good. That's a good shot. That's money. Good shot.
Its plume will mark for incoming air support. The sniper replied.
Oh, he didn't like that, did he? This is 2-2. I got green smoke on the ground in front of the building we're taking very effective fire from. How copy?
Afghan troops fired rocket-propelled grenades. The return fire built.
They're accurate. It's not a it's got to be a sniper. He's got to fire.
Heads up, hey, keep your heads down.
Sergeant Rogers ordered his troops back behind the wall.
Get here, peel out again. One at a time. One at a time. Hurry up, Vacola. Hurry up, Vacola. One at a time.
They're in this building. The other little one.
That one right there. Woo! That one was close. Keep your heads down if you're not firing. Woo!
The rounds passed by helmets. Then the cry went up.
We got him.
A Marine had been hit.
Keep your arm lifted. Push, Vacola.
It's Lance Corporal Vacola. Though he had barely been exposed, Lance Corporal Vacola had been shot through the shoulder. His bad luck was mixed with good. The round missed the bone. This was his second combat tour. He's the son of a Vietnam veteran. At first there was dread, but as his friend sensed his luck, the jokes began.
That looks really cool.
Vacola was lucid. He gave his medical tagging information.
KV 4647 OPAWS.
What is it?
KV 4647 OPAWS.
Had the bullet struck Vacola an inch to the right, it would have shattered his shoulder joint, changing his life.
7 OPAWS.
8 inches to the right, it would have found throat.
He's okay. He's back on his gun.
One instant of good fortune means little the next. After Vacola was shot, Marines working at a distant camp fired at least one guided ground-to-ground missile to help Kilo Company's fight. The ordnance did not hit the compound from which these Marines were taking fire. It hit another, nearby, several hundred yards to the left. At least 12 Afghan civilians were killed, including 5 children. An ugly day turned uglier for everyone involved, and presented the Marines in Marja with a fresh challenge when the fighting would finally let up. Then, they would be seeking civilian support. So I was shooting video that day, and my batteries ran out right after that. There isn't any more footage, and there's not footage of what I'm about to read to you next. Those civilians in the building needed care, so I want to describe what happened. The American medevac helicopter descended toward a shattered home on the Afghan steppe, sweeping grit against its mud-walled remains. Gunfire cracked past. Inside the ruins, several young infantrymen from Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, crouched near the bodies of freshly killed civilians. They had tallied 11 corpses so far. All but 2 were women and children. 2 American rockets had struck here a short while before, a pair of errant blows in a battle between the Marines and the Taliban that began on the morning of Valentine's Day. In the seconds after, as a dusty smoke cloud rose, a small girl scrambled out. For a moment she stood still. Then she ran, sprinting headlong to another nearby building, which the Americans occupied as a temporary outpost. Her father was detained inside. Soon the Marines were hustling across the field, crossing the open space where a gunfight had raged for hours. When they entered, they found one more survivor, a young woman, lying in a pool of blood. She was calling out children's names. The blast had severed both her legs and one of her arms. Covered with dirt, streaked with blood, she moaned and repeatedly asked for the kids. She tried sitting up. A corpsman and a few Marines consoled her. A lieutenant and a sergeant with radios called their commanding officer, seeking a Black Hawk medevac aircraft to rush the woman to care. Around her, the bodies of her family were scattered where they had died, not far from dead poultry and sheep. Gently, the Marines assured the dying woman that all would be okay. The Pentagon and the manufacturer of the weapon that struck here, known as a HIMARS, considered its ordnance to be precise. Its GPS sensors and guidance system helps the rockets fly scores of miles and slam to Earth within feet of the coordinates they were programmed to hit. Each carried a high explosive warhead and a fuse that can be set to burst in the air, maximizing the spread of shrapnel below. The manufacturer markets them as low collateral damage weapons. This is true on practice ranges. Battlefields rarely resemble ranges. More often, they are the lands where people live and work, and in this profoundly poor village, the Pentagon's precision weapons had hit precisely the wrong place. A sniper had been firing on the Marines from near another home, but the rockets landed here. A family following American instructions, stay inside and out of the way, had been almost instantly destroyed. By the time the Black Hawk arrived, the woman had died. The aircraft flew into a trap. Automatic fire erupted. Kalashnikov rifles joined in. The Taliban had been waiting and ambushed the aircraft as its wheels settled toward the ground. The lieutenant and sergeant ran into view, arms waving, warding the pilots off. Their company commander shouted to a radio operator, "Abort, abort, tell him to abort." The helicopter lurched forward, gathering speed. A rocket-propelled grenade whooshed into the swirling tower of dust. An explosion boomed behind the Black Hawk's tail rotor, a near miss. The helicopter flew across the field, landed, banked, and put down near the company commander to pick up a wounded Marine. It was Travis Ficola, who you saw a few months ago, whom the sniper had shot. Then it was gone. A lull replaced the din. Young men muttered curses. Inside the compounds, Afghan soldiers working with the Marines covered the dead with cloth. A Taliban commander, overheard on his own radio frequency, berated his fighters in Pashto for missing the Black Hawk. He'd almost realized his prize. "That was your chance," he said. These Marines were almost all young men on their first enlistment, the type of citizen who serves for 4 years and returns to civilian life. They were thoroughly trained, visibly fit, thoughtfully equipped, and generally eager to participate in what they were told would be a historic fight a campaign preordained for American military lore. Most of them were also so new to war that the dead women and children were the first casualties they had seen. Many of them wanted then, and still want now, to connect their battlefield service to something greater than a memory reel of gunfights, explosions, and grievous wounds. They wanted to understand accidental killings as isolated mistakes in a campaign characterized by sound strategy, moral authority, and lasting success. They didn't get this, at least not all of it. Instead, the Major General commanding NATO forces in southern Afghanistan circulated a publicly palatable version. The HIMARS rockets, he said, hit the correct building after all. For years, the Marine Corps and Pentagon said little more, even as Marja, seized by Marines and then held by their Afghan army and police partners, returned to Taliban and drug baron control. This book is about the men and women who served in American combat service in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed the terrorist attacks of 2001. It covers these combatants with a simple organizing idea that they are human. It details personal experiences, what these experiences were, how they unfolded, what effects they had upon those who were there, and it covers them from their own perspectives, offering their own interpretations of their wars. More than 3 million Americans have served in Afghanistan or Iraq since late 2001. Many went to both wars. Nearly 7,000 of them died. Tens of thousands more were wounded. President Donald Trump's former chief of staff, retired Marine Corps General John F. Kelly, who lost a son in combat in Afghanistan and under whom I briefly served 3 decades ago when he led the course that trains new Marine infantry officers, called these men and women the best 1% this country produces. He added, "Most of you as Americans don't know them. Many of you don't know anyone who knows any one of them." This book is an effort to remedy that, in part through demystification. In doing so, it also rejects many senior officer views. It channels those who did the bulk of the fighting with the unapologetic belief that the voices of combatants of the lower and middle rank are more valuable and more likely to be candid and rooted in battlefield experience than those of the generals and admirals who order them to action and often try to speak for them too. I'm hoping in the room there are some fellow humanitarians. I'm sure this library attracts people interested in the traditions of the liberal arts and in critical thinking skills. But maybe a few of you, after what I just read and what I just showed you on the video, are thinking, so what? Right? It happens. Mistakes get made on the battlefield. People die. Unfortunate casualties in the grander march of progress and purpose. So if you think this way, whether you say it or not, I want to address you. Let's swing away from the tactical now. This was tactical level stuff, and discuss the operational and the strategic. Let's put this strike that you just saw and heard about in a fuller perspective. The years since 2001, as I just said, have seen roughly 3 million men and women serving in the armed forces in Afghanistan or Iraq. These people didn't make policies, they were stuck in them. Messes their leaders often created for them. The policies that cohered into the wars, in the end, have not succeeded, even though the first and last ambition, the diminishment or destruction of Al-Qaeda, and now its more homicidal stepchild, the Islamic State, was and is just. But the years under which these wars have been waged are a profile, nonetheless, of failure, secrecy, and cover-up. And by failure, I mean large-scale and lethal failures. And by failure, I mean on the Pentagon and the president's own terms, all 3 presidents. Those of you who know of me, or if any of you have heard or seen me before, you know that I'm not a member of any political party. I don't like either of them, and I reserve most of my withering criticism for my own former service, the Marine Corps, into which one of my sons is likely now headed. So I don't pull my punches, and I don't shoot from the red state or the blue state. I just say what I feel and hear. So let's say it. Our wars were characterized by mission creep and strategic drift and tragically flawed expectations. And when I talk about failures, I'm going to use the Pentagon's own language of their own ambitions and then put the results against the slogans. Let's start with number one, the very name, a global war on terror. The Islamic State did not exist until after we invaded Iraq. It formed and metastasized and spread in occupation and has since fostered terrorism across much of the world, exactly the type of crime a global war on terrorism is supposed to prevent. Another reason we were given for the wars was protection of populations, Afghan and Iraqi. There are many estimates on the number of civilian deaths, but the American wars, between direct military action and the violent social forces that American military action unleashed, has resulted in hundreds of thousands of dead across Afghanistan, Iraq, and now neighboring Syria. This doesn't count the wounded or the displaced, and it doesn't count the vast destruction of not just property on the small scale like the home in the video you just saw, but entire neighborhoods and cities razed like Ramadi and Raqqa, which before these wars started were fully functioning and intact parts of Middle Eastern culture, heritage, and society. Now they're rubble. That's not protection of populations. And people who still use such stock phrases should be ashamed. Creating Afghan and Iraqi security forces that would stand on their own. Another reason that we were given in different years of the campaign for our continued investment of our blood and treasure. We have made or deputized well north of 1 million armed men, paid them and trained them and equipped them with weapons and all manner of other equipment, and an outsized fraction of these men have simply vanished, yielding their weapons and sometimes their skills to American foes. This is the human and logistical clay of that overworked phrase, forever war, and it's on us, and we'll be paying for it for years beyond those in which the American organizers of these wars retire in comfort and prestige. Yes, I should add, some of these forces do still stand, mixed with militias and supported by American and Iranian and other national programs and funds, but they're poorly led and they're brutal and they're small compared to their design and they're nothing like a value. I should also add as a humanitarian that they suffer and die routinely in quantities that far exceed our own casualties. Eradication of poppy, you guys probably remember that one. This video was shot in Afghanistan's Poppy Belt, which is notable because we built that irrigation area under a USAID program in the 1950s. And previous generations of pie-eyed Americans had seen it as an agricultural belt. Well, it became an opium production engine, and it's still producing poppy today. Women's rights, you guys getting the idea? These wars, in short, on the Pentagon and our government's own terms, were practical failures on a grand scale. How did we get there? We can bandy about and, if we want, dismantle the ideological tropes like American exceptionalism or the doctrinal absurdities like trying counterinsurgency doctrine with conventional troops in a short time in occupied countries. But let's just talk numbers. Rough numbers will allow us to show the depth of our conceptual failure. And I think from conceptual failures, practical failures naturally follow. So let's do the math. Rough math, back of the envelope level stuff. If you're Googling me to fact check me as I do this on your phone, You'll see I'm rounding my numbers a bit, so I declare that at the outset. But I'm going to give you 3 numbers. The first number's 30 million. The second number is 180,000. And the third number is 100,000. Now I'm going to define what these are values for. 30 million, that's roughly the population of Afghanistan. It's also roughly the population of Iraq. I'm going to give you a guess. Anyone know another entity with 30 million people? All right, Texas. Texas has about 30 million people. 180,000, that's the number at peak during the surge years of Americans in uniform in Afghanistan. I'm sorry, in Iraq during the surge years, late President Bush. 100,000 is mid-first term President Obama, when the surge had moved to Afghanistan. We had about 100,000 Americans in uniform on the ground in Afghanistan, round about the time that this video was made and a little bit after. 30 million, 180,000, and 100,000. Now let's take Iraq off the map. Let's take Afghanistan off the map and put Texas on the map. Who in the room thinks we could take 180,000 Americans, go down to Texas, overthrow its government, establish a new constitution, set up a bunch of outposts, tell them we're going to change your schools, and tell them that we're here to help, and you're going to get along with us. We'll be here 10 years or so. These are our appointed local representatives. We're going to run some elections for them. We're going to have them elected, and they're going to become your government. How do you think that's going to go? Now try it with 100,000 people, which is what we did in Afghanistan. Now think about the difference between Texas and these two countries. In Texas, we share a language, a history, often a religion, a culture, an understanding about who we are. In Afghanistan and Iraq, almost all of the force can't even talk to anybody, much less understand them culturally. I say this, what were we even thinking? How did we ever get into a circumstance where conceptually we thought this was possible? And how do we square this with our ideas about who we think we are? And then think about what you owe the 6 people who I profiled in this book, who went there to these places to do their best for us, and I think had their good faith and their labor betrayed. That's it. You can throw your shoes now if you wish. You coming up, Kathleen?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming to Iowa for your first visit to the state. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. And I would, first of all, I would like to thank you, Chris, for your service as a journalist. I know that I think especially in this day and age that those of us who believe that journalism plays a crucial role in our society and our democracy should stand up and say so, and that recognize the fact that what you do is important and that we owe you our thanks. So thank you very much. And I'd like to also thank you for this book. You know, as I was thinking about it, you made it easy for me to say that I can't say that I enjoyed it, but I thank you very much for it. It was sometimes very emotionally difficult to read. I kept thinking about my 2 sons as I read it and read about these guys' lives. But it was wonderfully reported, researched, and written. It's very honest and powerful, and it provided a lot of insight into not only what the soldiers are going through, have gone through, but also for somebody who doesn't come from a military background, it provided insight into the military culture and mindset, which I think is very, very valuable. So the question that I have, and I encourage you all, please, to write down your questions, and our helpers will pick them up. But my question for you is that we live in Iowa, and there's something that goes on here, a little thing that goes on here every 4 years called the Iowa caucuses. So I'm kind of curious, how many people in this group have seen a presidential candidate yet? How many of you have seen more than one presidential candidate? How many? Yeah, in the flash. How many people have seen all of them who've come through? It's hard this time around. But how many of you intend to see all of them if you can? So, people in Iowa take their politics very seriously. And so the question I would have for you, Chris, is that these people are your proxies. They're going to be, they could very well be talking to every presidential candidate in their living room or go to somebody else's living room. So a few months ago, the Des Moines Register published the Iowa poll and asked potential voters what they thought their top issues were in this campaign. And they were things like, health care and climate change and race relations. But the only thing that was even vaguely international was trade. Even terrorism wasn't on the list this time around. What should these folks be asking the presidential candidates regarding the wars?
Let me start somewhere else. You said on your list of issues that were important to voters this time around, the wars didn't show up. Nothing really related to the military showed up on that list. I'd argue that's by design. There's something that changed in this country in my lifetime. When we got out of, I was born in 1964, and I remember the Vietnam War. And my dad was in the Vietnam War. And we had selective service then. We had the draft. We had conscription. And Americans went to war. Now, there were exceptions, and there were unfair assumptions baked into the draft. But we had a draft that essentially served as a national lottery to go to war. And when that happened, people had a stake, and people paid attention. They interrogated and examined the foreign policies and wondered what they thought about these foreign policies, because they could have their own lives or their children's lives or their friends' lives called to go serve and take on the risks of wars that we now know didn't work out then either. When we got rid of the draft, a few years before I came into the military, when we got rid of the draft, something happened. We got a self-selecting group, an all-volunteer fighting class that showed up for its own reasons, and nobody else had to worry about going to war at all. My argument, and I say this a lot, is the thing you don't have to worry about affecting you is the thing you stop thinking about. And so we don't think about the wars. You don't have an incentive to think about the wars unless you have come from a family that's serving in them, or unless you really have an interest in foreign policy or military affairs. It doesn't amount to very much of it. So to answer your question, I've puzzled for a long time, how do you get politicians to pay attention to the wars? And the answer is, I don't know. I mean, there's a thought exercise we sometimes engage in, around the shop. I work with a few other veterans. I'm mentoring a former Marine sniper and a former Navy explosive ordnance disposal tech who are in journalism, and we're part of a team, and we work together all the time. And we, I've said several times, we got this idea from a former platoon commander in the Pesh Valley in Afghanistan, that if the country had a draft of only 1,000 people annually, and we drafted these 1,000 people on national TV, say you're from age 18 to 25, you can be drafted. Regardless of your gender, no exemptions. If we ran this draft, then you'd have everyone's attention. Can you imagine? It'd be the best TV show ever. right? Everyone to be tuned in, wondering if they were going to be, or someone they knew was going to be called to serve. And I would argue if we had this draft, these wars would not have gone as they did, right? I'd argue that the people might show up and levitate the Pentagon and ask it what the hell it's doing. Absent that, Kathleen, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't know what you can do to the politicians, but try to talk to them about it. But they know that they have the polling data too, and they know these are not big issues, and so they don't pay much attention to it either.
Unless they get questions at every single stop from people like this.
I don't think that'll carry over. I say that having spent now about 20 years trying to get people's attention, and I find that just like the people who go to the military now are self-selecting, people who care about these issues are self-selecting, and it doesn't spread out into the larger culture. I regret to say, I'm sorry, but I'm usually the darkest person in the room, so I'll wear it here.
Okay. Questions from the audience. After what you said, how do you rationalize your son's decision to join the Marines?
I'm against it. He's also a young man. He can make his own decisions. I felt I have a moral duty to tell him what I know, and I've expressed it to him. I'm also mindful that my father, a Vietnam vet, told me I was nuts to join the Marine Corps in the 1980s. And all it did was hasten my journey into that cave. So I don't have a lot of influence over my son. I've connected him to many veterans. I've urged him to talk with a lot of people and try to make an informed decision. A lot of people join the Marine Corps because they want to be part of something like a special club. They have a sense of they already have a sense of public service. And then they want to be part of an organization that has an ethos of public service. They want to join that club. And then there's something else the military does. It's one of the few quick routes towards young adult validation in this country, right? I mean, if you go in a couple of years, you kind of have a stamp on you of serving that is recognized across much of the society. There's nothing else really like that. I've said to my son, so you want to join a cool club? He's already a year-round surfer. He surfs through the winter in a wetsuit in the Atlantic Ocean. He's a tough kid. He's a good kid. He's a fit kid. He's a bright kid. I've told him, you're already in a pretty cool club, those winter surfers, and the price of admission there is not going to be your legs, and you're not going to have to kill anybody. So think about it. And he kind of says, yes, Dad, and calls the recruiter. That's how it goes.
Can you give us any updates on any or some of the characters in the book? How are they coping?
So they're mostly where we left them, but one, Doc Kirby, if those of you who've read the book know that Doc was a hospital corpsman, which is the Navy's term for trauma medic. They serve with the Marines. Doc was shot through the face in 2006 on Christmas Day and had a terrible, you like to think there's a long arc of recovery, but in his case, it was a long, deep descent into pain, into excessive drinking, into pill popping, painkillers, into divorce, into suicidal ideation, and then a suicide attempt, into a loss of sense of purpose, the aimlessness that can result after being in a tight unit with a real mission to being alone and cast outside because of your wounds. Eventually, Doc got, in I guess the plainest way to say it is, a new face. Pro bono, a surgeon, David Hirsch in New York, helped him rebuild his face, repositioned his jaw, gave him new dental implants, and realigned things so that they worked. And Doc he's doing really well. I'm actually seeing him, today's Thursday, I'm seeing him. Is this going to go out live? No one tweet this, he doesn't know. I'm showing up and seeing him at an event on Saturday. He'll be in the city. He's doing really well. He's about to be honored. Doc's that, if you call it a success story, I don't know, but Doc has had a much better outcome and he's changed his trajectory. And I find him pretty inspirational to climb out of the hole he was in and be what he is, doing what he is now. He's working again.
Do you feel that PTSD is a worse epidemic now, or just more, that there is more known about it?
So I'm not a social scientist. I don't have the data. I don't think almost any of the particulars that I've discussed are unique to our wars. Right? I think these are universal experiences of war. War sucks. War's bad for you. You know, as far back as we can go into the literature, across cultures, we see this evidence. One of my embarrassments as a young man, I realized at some point I was opting to go to war, and at some point sort of my soul kind of rejected this, or kind of revolted, years and years into it. And I realized, you know, everything I know and learned experientially was already in the literature. It's already there. Why didn't I buy it? And I had read some of that stuff before I went in, a lot of it. Why didn't I buy it? So as for PTSD, I think we have ample evidence in the literature that this is an old condition that we have finally begun to, you know, lessen the stigma of and accept socially. So I think it is more prominent in our culture now for cultural reasons, not because as a matter of like epidemiology, it exists at a different rate among combatants today than it did before.
Did you find it, when you were writing this book, did you find it traumatic for yourself to revisit some of the things that you went through?
So when I started on the book, and I don't remember what year, there was a point at which, probably after that video, where I realized I'd spent all these years out there with different units doing different things in different places, and in other wars too, away from these. I realized that I wanted to make you know, the accumulation of what I had learned, try to cohere into something more than 1,200 and 1,500 word news stories. And then as I got going on that, I thought this might be cathartic, right? Maybe this is gonna like rinse the brain. It didn't work that way. I got more and more angry the deeper I went in, because I started unloading everybody else to go with mine. And so I thought, I mean, is trauma the word? No. I don't feel traumatized by writing the book. I feel like I deepened and broadened my understanding of the human costs of the wars, the human experience of the wars, and I felt a lot of that. I don't know that that's a trauma. I mean, I have you asked about PTSD, you know, I have a way of thinking about it. I think PTSD is totally natural. You know, if you go into the forest long enough, you become a forest creature. You go into these stories long enough, they become part of you. Pretty simple. I accept it. I accept that war changed me. I went to a lot of therapy. I got a lot better. I lowered my hypervigilance. I can now go into a restaurant and sit with my back to the door. I don't travel with, you know, first aid kits and seatbelt cutters and all that stuff. I can take my kids to the grocery store, and I don't think about where the exits are, how to herd them safely out if something happens. I've dimmed a lot of that down, and as I started to get better, I was still really pissed off, and I decided to stop going to therapy for a particular reason. I thought my anger was earned, and I wanted to keep it. I didn't want to let go some of what I knew. So there came a point where I got, let's say, 2/3 better, and I thought, you know, that's pretty good. I'll take it right there, you know. So some people, you know, you play a lot of football, you walk away with a limp. You go to war a long time, you leave with a scowl. I'm all right with that. Am I traumatized? I don't know. You guys can. There's probably some shrinks in the room. You tell me. I got thick skin. Shout it out.
How did you choose the 6 individuals to write about amongst the hundreds that you must have interacted with?
So, mercenary terms, writer terms, like Noah's Ark, right? I wanted people who were distinct from each other. And then I wanted people, if I assembled them in linear fashion, in aggregate, together would deliver many of the particular, repeated, common experiences of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I had hundreds, like you said, of people I knew. And then I kind of went through my memories of those I knew, and who was hit by an IED, who was in on an ambush, who got ambushed, who was involved in airstrikes, who was present for civilian casualties, who lost friends, who got wounded. And I didn't want to duplicate those experiences. So then it was like mix or match. It was like a Noah's Ark, except I only had 6, beds in the birthing area. And so I chose 6 who I thought in aggregate would give me a book that if one person read it, and like you said, you didn't know military culture, Kathleen, and I get it. Most people don't. I thought if someone's going to spend, a few nights reading 300 or 350 pages, when they get done with my book, they will know intimately at the human level many of the most common experiences and outcomes of this war. I also tried to choose one person who I thought was doing pretty well, because not everyone came home with the same intensity of struggle as Doc Kirby did. And it later turned out that as I got to know characters who I thought were doing a little better, who I had chosen initially, as I really immersed myself in their experience and I tried to download their brains, I realized they weren't doing that well either. They just had, hidden it, behind masks of functionality and competence and high social skills. But when they really opened up, I found that, they had a lot of stuff rattling around between their ears too.
What do you think of reports that President Trump is planning to forgive some troops who were accused of murdering civilians in POWs in the Mideast?
I don't know if that's a trial balloon or not. Let's see where it goes. Let's see what rationale actually gets presented, not leaked. That's a tough one, though. I also have found, and this is going to maybe disappoint some of you, but I'm pretty firm in it, that they've also included a number of Marines in the initial discussion, and I don't know how accurate the discussion is, and I don't know what will actually be borne out, but they've included some Marines who urinated on dead Taliban. And to me, there's a difference between that and murdering a prisoner. I'm not endorsing any of it, but I also think that these aren't like apples and oranges. These are like apples and chainsaws. And I struggle with that, especially since the Marines who were involved in the urination were, on the Court of Military Appeal, as, for court-martials are appealed, have determined that there was undue command influence, and their prosecutions may have been essentially predetermined by command influence. So that is a different circumstance than the others. Is a pardon the appropriate recourse? That's not for me to decide. But I am having trouble sorting out exactly what this is about. I would add one more thing. Are there any police officers here in the room? Former police officers? Any military in the room? Former military? There's one thing I would add that's important as we assess the discussion about some of these people who pardons are being considered, some of whom aren't even convicted yet. It's ongoing legal proceedings against them. It's not lost on me that their own people testified against them in significant quantities. That is unusual, really unusual in the military. When your own people come out against you, something's suspicious, something feels shady, something in my gut tells me this is different than the typical allegations that often come off the battlefield where there can be some gray. If your own people are coming out against you and testifying like that, we're into probably some pretty stark events. So I offer that. It's purposefully inconclusive. I don't know where it's going, but like many people here in the room, I'm both confused and troubled by it.
What do you feel is the best way that the U.S. can eventually disengage from Afghanistan and Iraq? I listened to an interview this week with David Petraeus, and he said, the Mideast is a difficult place, but you can't just walk away from it.
Especially if you're making all that money, David.
Vegas rules don't apply. Kind of the idea that what happens in the Mideast doesn't stay in the Mideast. It has this ripple effect around the world.
So look, I don't propose instant disengagement. I don't think it's that binary. This is what I propose. I say it all the time. Look at me. You can tell I do not have any strategic competencies. All right? I don't pretend to. I was trained no higher than a Marine captain. Since then, I've wandered around and crawled around with a notebook and asked people how they spell their names. Right? I don't have training or inclination to be a strategic thinker. I'm an expert in exactly nothing. I do think this. We need a full-throated, broad-based national conversation about what we're doing in these wars. Let the foreign policy establishments work through this. And here's what I'd propose the outcome should be. That we set some objectives, realistic objectives. What are we doing in Afghanistan and Iraq? What do we hope to achieve realistically? Now, next step, how do we marshal our resources to achieve what we hope to achieve? How will we know? What's our measure when we have achieved it? And then how do we bring people home? What we have instead of that is just sheer drift. And people like David Petraeus, who seemed like every year gave us a new idea for why we were doing something, basically was riding a big machine with no off button. Show me the off button, guys. What are we doing? How are we doing it? How will we know when we've done it? And are we marshaling our resources to get there? I don't think anyone in this room, I don't think anyone I've hardly ever met can answer those questions thoughtfully and convincingly. I had an exercise I used to do. You know, I was in a funny position. I was covering the rank and file. People of lower rank were my ideal subjects. Captain and below in the officer ranks, sergeant and below, lance corporals, privates, first class, warrant officers, people who actually lived this and did this stuff. And they were younger than me mostly. I was in my 40s during most of this, and they were in their 20s. They were a generation behind me. But I was a peer to their battalion and brigade commanders. The battalion commanders in Iraq, you know, pre-surge, were my classmates. I knew some of them personally. One of them I once gave first aid to. The brigade commanders in Afghanistan were also my peers, and some of my former instructors were the generals running this show. In other words, I was really socially and professionally connected to the generation that was running the wars at the operational level. And I used to go to them. I'd take a sheet of paper, you know, and say, hey, and write down for me two things. You got one side of the paper and you got another side of the paper. On one side, write down for me how what you're doing connects to people being safer in your hometown. Draw me that line, because I assume you enlisted out of your hometown, so you had some idea that you wanted to protect it. The other is, show me how we win this, however you defined win. Tell me how we turn this around and make it right and make it stick. And I did that for years and years and years. And you know how many people filled out the paper, one side or the other? 0. 0. So when people say like a colonel is a senior military officer, I mean, I guess if I'd stayed in, I'd be a general now. I mean, I never would have gotten promoted, as you can tell. But if I stayed in and did make it to general, these were my people. I knew I wouldn't have answers either. I couldn't think my way through the puzzle. And so I say, a colonel, who, you know, many of you, if a colonel walked in here all bedecked with ribbons and the chicken on his collar and a shiny uniform and the core frame shoes, many of you would think, wow, that's a senior military officer. I would say, that dude's a senior military officer the way a bus driver is a senior motorist. Can't get off the route. Can't get off the route. Doesn't set the schedule. Stuck in it too. Actually, once I realized that, I had some empathy for these people. It tempered some of my anger at them. The issues, the problems were higher than them.
Over the years, that you covered the war, did you see changes in the Marines and soldiers,
Oh, sure.
their attitudes, etc.? And how about you personally?
So, I mean, a lot of you were there, right? We're in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, the forces got better at the tactical and technical level. They got really sharp. That was one of the great sorrows. You know, I mean, the thing, after a few years of war, and I hate to use sports metaphor, but you create a varsity. People really got good. Procedures got good. And then the people who stuck around and re-enlisted really felt it was their calling. They were deeply committed. And so by the time we were, 5 years into Iraq, the company commanders and the senior NCOs had a heck of a lot of experience. And the equipment finally caught up, I would say, it wasn't really until Afghanistan that I started to see the whole force very well equipped. So that would be like, when I say Afghanistan, I mean the Obama surge. That would be like 2010 roughly. The sorrow was seeing that connected to something that wasn't working. And we knew it wasn't working by then, clearly. And I started to see among the troops, I would say certainly by 2006, a clear sense that this wasn't working, and a lot of morale problems, and people who were fighting for each other, people who didn't think it was going to stick, people who hated Iraq and Afghanistan. At the top level, they were talking about how we're going to save these countries. There was a lot of hatred in the force, a fair amount of racism. People had soured, and it was awful to see. And then the other thing that happens, and it takes a while for this, is candor occurs. When you're in something and you're committed to it, you want to believe in it, and you often do for a while. And then you get a little distance on it. Maybe you get out of the Army or the Marine Corps, and you start to process it. You start to get a broader perspective on what you did and what happened to you and your friends. And the veteran community began to question the wars quite quickly in a way that the active duty forces can't. You know what it's like. I mean, go into your office tomorrow and say, you all don't know what the hell you're doing, boss. It doesn't work out anywhere, and it doesn't work out in a deeply hierarchical and regimented and busy organization like the Marine Corps or the Army. But yeah, I saw a lot of change from the flash of patriotism after 2001 and the desire to believe in the country and its leadership in 2003 that many of the people in uniform showed up with, to also people who just wanted to go to war. It's not uncommon in the military that people want to do what they've trained to do. I saw that all of these elements really informed the force for the first few years, and then it began to sharply taper off.
Most of the people that you write about in the book are men, but the war also, in their stories, it had a profound effect on the women in their lives, their wives and their mothers, some of whom you are main characters in this book. Any insight into the wider ripple effects that this war is having as the combatants come home, on their families, their communities?
So the number of people who serve is around 3 million. That's less than 1% of the population. But if you just look at the 1%, you miss a lot, because every one of those people has a larger familial and social network. Lovers, spouses, close friends, children, parents, next-door neighbors, who all were affected by the war. And so the density gets way past 1%. I don't know where it stops. You're probably still in the single digits. But that's still not much in a democracy, right? Let's say we're at 5%. So 5 times that. So 15 million people, had a direct stake. Say you're at 10%. So, 30 or 31 million people had a direct stake in the war in a country of 320 or 330 million. Doesn't amount to much politically. But personally, this has a profound influence. I mean, the families who participated have been changed by it. Many of them sense that it didn't work. Many of them fiercely still want to believe. I get that. A lot of the population is clustered geographically around the bases, which are clustered in the south and the west. And many of the retirees settle around the bases. So we have kind of created islands or pockets where there's a richer understanding of the wars and of military life, and then others who are scattered, like in Iowa, or where I am in Rhode Island, where a war can be almost invisible. Although veterans have ways of finding each other, you veterans in the room know it. You can tell. There's patches and license plates. There's little indicators. There's tattoos. You'd see them all over me if I wasn't wearing this painted-on suit. That help us find each other and engage in the conversation. But in some ways, at least where I live, away from bases, the understanding of the war almost exists like samizdat literature and hidden exchanges, like early Christians, right? You know, like the fish. The veterans find each other and tend to be quiet. Tend to be pretty quiet in the larger population because there's a sense that they're not understood. And I think it's a sorrow, and I don't see it being reversed for the same reason I described at the outset of the questions. Without a draft, without a national lottery, it's a self-selecting bunch.
Do the people in charge of these wars care about the toll?
So yeah, if I took out my phone and went through my WhatsApp, you'd see I had a former Marine sergeant today texting me, like, how do these people even sleep? Do they lose any sleep? We don't know the answer. There's not a lot of candor in the senior accounts yet from these wars. The architects of the wars have, in the main, either written defensive books or, books that are, filled with, leadership aphorisms, how to run an organization. Let me tell you how, but I was a general once. We haven't seen that kind of candor. I don't know. That's a good question. I'd like to know. I'd like to believe that they do, but I also know, even when I was a captain, which is really low. I mean, the bar to be a Marine Corps captain, if you're a Marine Corps lieutenant, is basically don't get a DWI and be able to fog a mirror, and you're going to be a captain. So, and so I was pretty low. But even at that low position, I was so surrounded by people below me, didn't want to tell me what's going on. The sergeant polished the information before he gave it to the lieutenants, who polished the information before they gave it to me. So I was living in a bubble of airbrushed crap, and it goes like that higher and higher. And I often would meet. No, I wouldn't say I didn't often meet. I would episodically meet senior people in these wars. And what I noticed about them is they knew the plan. They knew what they were saying. They knew what they planned to do. They were articulate in what they were trying to do, and they had no idea what was actually going on. And the perspective that I heard from the ground or saw firsthand on the ground was at such odds with what they actually seemed genuinely to believe. And they weren't fools. They're smart people, hard-working people. They got up early. They stayed up late. They absorbed the information as it gave to them. But the information was really skewed and airbrushed because the military's full of yes people. And so I don't know.
One of the most interesting episodes in the book was when Doc, the grievously wounded soldier, and his family, including his mother, his pissed off mother, met with former President Bush to raise these issues. You want to talk about that a little bit?
So whatever you think of Bush, and I don't care, that's on you. I don't care where you come down on that. There's a lot of variation of opinion on that. He's done one thing that I find fascinating and support as a human being. He meets with veterans regularly, one-on-one. Doc Kirby was a random, almost unscheduled appointment. Of course, nothing's unscheduled in the Bush Presidential Library, but this is how unscheduled this almost was. Doc was in Texas from Georgia, where he lives, for a NASCAR event at which he was being honored as a vet. And one of Bush's former aides was at the event and saw Doc was being honored and approached the family and said, I bet I can get you an appointment tomorrow to see the president. Would you like that? The family didn't have any dress clothes or anything. They were at a NASCAR event. And the next morning, they ended up meeting Bush in his library. And they were wearing, like T-shirts and plaid, how we all dress at NASCAR. That's how they went. And Bush opened the door himself, no staff, no handlers, sat without a barricade between the family and him, around a coffee table, served them coffee with his own hands, and listened to them one by one. There were 5 of them. Doc has 2 siblings and 2 parents, and Doc, so 5 people. Doc went in with a ball cap, which he didn't take off for the president, baseball cap, and the president gave him some shit about that, and they talked. Whatever you think of Bush, I think this is quite something. He's done this with a lot. He doesn't seek credit for it. I tried to fact check it with Bush. He declined to engage because he wasn't looking for any credit for it. I don't think he really cared what I thought. I think he was mostly interested in whatever is driving him to do this. And Doc found it ultimately very validating. His mother, I won't spoil it, but his mother basically teed off on the president. She had spent, she had like one night to get ready, and she prepared a monologue. And when her turn came to talk, Doc was like, "Who are you and what do you do?" And or the president was like, went to the siblings, "Who are you and what do you do? Tell me about you. What's up in your life?" Came to her, and she's like, "Hi, I'm the mom." And she really uncorked something on the president, eye to eye. And he sat there across the table. He shifted apparently uncomfortably in the seat a few times, according to the 5 other people in the room. But he was very respectful, and he listened to it. And Doc ultimately, and his mom ultimately, came away feeling very validated by that. The samizdat thing I talked about, where you feel alone. I was talking to a mother who lost her son, what they call a green on blue. Afghan soldiers killed him. Murdered him. He was training him, and they murdered him. Imagine that? And she described for me what it was like after she found out, after the notification came to her door, and she needed groceries, and she went to the store, and she's wandering around a grocery store full of Americans who are just shopping, going through their lives, people like you and me, and she wanted to jump up on the register and say, "Hi, I don't want to say your name because I don't remember. I'd have to go through my notes to see if I'm cleared to say this publicly," but she said, "Hi, my name is," and my son was just killed in Afghanistan. That's how desperately alone people feel. And President Bush, by letting the Kirby family in and sit around in his room, again, without staff, without barricades, I say, if more of them would do this, we might not have gotten into the messes we're in.
What comes next for you? Writing a new book? Strictly journalism?
My ultimate goal is to disappear, vanish, go into commercial fishing. I'm dead serious. I've gone half feral. I shaved and got a haircut for you guys. I'm pretty deeply antisocial. I'm quite angry. I don't see a remedy besides physical labor. I have a phrase I use for myself, which is hands heal brains, when I do hack carpentry or plant potatoes or I raise poultry. When I'm butchering poultry, I actually kind of feel okay when I'm using my hands. My goal is to get out of this gig eventually. I'll keep writing. I just wrote this year's 2 book proposals on my weekends that I'll be circulating, and hopefully I'll have a publisher still. Hopefully this book is done well enough that I retain a seat at the table as a writer. I think I do. So I'll just keep writing, but I've been saying these things to a lot of blank faces for a long time, and maybe it's just time for me to go out and swing an axe against trees and drop some pots down to the ocean bottom and crank up some product and mind my own business and shut up. That's probably what's in store for me.
Does your body of work have a mission? I think journalists don't usually refer to their work like that, but when you think about the body of your work, would you do you think of it in terms of?
I mean, I'll probably have trouble articulating, but I've tried to cover across time, articulate and show the human experiences and consequences of war. I recently spent a chunk of time, both in person and then on the phone and on text, with a war awareness potter, former Marine of my generation, a Gulf War vet like me, who makes these cups. And the cups are graphic and brutal, like some of the stuff I read to you, but they have their own language. He puts all these stampings and marks on them. He gives them away. You can't buy them. Been making them for almost 20 years. He's given away almost, I think, 22,000 of them. I asked him the same question you just asked me, and I'll maybe hide behind his statement. He said, I'll get it wrong, you can look it up, and you'll find I'll get it close, but it'll be wrong. My memory's not sharp enough for quotes, but it was something like, I would like my work to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in this world. How about that? That's his statement, not mine, but, I'll get on that bus. That'd be pretty good. Meanwhile, I just want to show you what it was, and then you come to your own conclusions about what it means.
It sounds like a good note to end on. So please join me once again in thanking Chris for being with us this evening.